one thing that we're really good at is, as humans, especially really intelligent humans, is we're good at rationalizing things. So what happens is something happens in our life, and we create all this story around it to make sense of it.
Right.
But to a child from 0 to 7, nothing actually makes sense. You're making sense of the world. You're making it up as you go along. And so what happens is we all get scripts that we're handed, and there's stuff in it that's amazing and makes us who we are and what we love about ourselves and our personality and our character. And then there's those other things that hold us back. It's and everyone has some level of, call it a ceiling or a limiting belief or something that's keeping them stuck. It's just a matter of if they're aware of it, and then if they've learned the tools to reprogram that thing. It's like we're very efficient creatures in the sense that if you teach a human how to do something and you repeat it, it gets ingrained. It's like I don't ride a bicycle every day, but I could hop on and ride a bicycle. It's like the saying, it's just like riding a bike. It's because what happens is we store our programming, and this is going a little deep. We store our actual emotional, psychological programming in the cellular system of our physical body. So it's very intertwined. And so what happens is something happens in our life, and then we store it in the body, and it stays there until we learn how to move it. And so the pairing of the physical movement with the emotional and the mental reprogramming is very, very important. Because what happens is like, you probably deal with this all the time, like people with stuck movement patterns, like they're like stuck in their shoulders or in their hips or in their spine or just stiff. And when things get moving, it feels more flowy, it feels more natural. And what actually happens when we use tools like movement and breath work and TRE, which you experienced the other night, and some other like physical release tools, is if you're attuned to it, emotions actually come up, stories come up when you're doing this stuff. Because what's happening is you're flooding the body with energy, and then you're getting things unstuck in your cellular system, and they're actually coming out to be moved, which is really what we're designed to do. If you look at even the word emotion, it just means energy in motion. And so emotions are just energy that's just moving throughout us. And what happens is we're taught to suppress some and like really keep it stuck in us. And we're taught to indulge in some, depending on who you are and what you learned. And so it's really, really interesting stuff. And me having, I was in the fitness space for over 10 years, having that background and now moving over to more of the deep unconscious, mostly emotional, spiritual, mental body, the patterns are so similar. I don't know if you notice, like when someone's doing a new movement pattern for the first time and they're like can't get it and they're frustrated, you can see it on their face. They have a certain response to it. The same way when someone gets something, they light up. The face lights up, the smile goes up. That's the connection between the mental, the emotional, and the physical programming. Is like we're actually conditioning our bodies to respond based on what's happening in our system.
That's fascinating. And so coming from more of the physical side, I see it all the time in people that thought they needed to move a certain way, and then they get outside of that box, they start moving differently, they start unlocking new range of motion in their body, start developing this new sense of flow, and it's just a cascade effect of then they start getting into more of this like spiritual development, and getting in tune with what is my movement practice all about, and connecting this with your life experience.
Well, one thing I love about what you do, and I experience this when I work with you, and movement practices, the way you teach them, is that it brings your focus inward to what's happening in your body. So much of our world today, movement exercise-wise, and then also just in our physical world, is distracting. Distracting in the sense that it sends our focus external. And when you just take a moment and like all sorts of practices like meditation, like I do movement like Qigong and Kundalini and Tai Chi and some primal movement. And what happens is when I do that, like the attention goes inward. I feel my body, I actually see my body moving inside out.
Right.
And like every time you go inside, you send your focus inside, you get to experience the world the way that you desire, as opposed to the world telling you how to experience it. Which is really, really important if you want to live a life of fulfillment and happiness and satisfaction and love and connection.
Yeah. Some of my deepest flows in movement, I actually feel like almost like I'm witnessing what's going on.
Yep.
And
become the observer of yourself.
Yes. Like you're directing it, but you're not overly controlling it.
Yep.
And I imagine that's what we're striving for with an emotional state.
Dude, that's flow state, and that's basically coming from the unconscious. What you're doing is you've repeated your patterns so many times that your body knows how to do it unconsciously. And what happens is when you allow yourself to drop out of the mind of controlling it into the body of allowing it, you just move so far, so beautifully, so naturally. And really all you're doing is you're allowing your system to express in the way that it wants to.
Right.
Yeah. Without all of this mental chatter that keeps us all stuck.
Yes. It's this sense of like there's no conflict. It's only acceptance, what's there.
Freedom, peace, calm, joy.
I love that.
Yeah. And most people are taught. And here's the thing that's really difficult, likely in what you do and also in what I do in teaching people these things, is we're taught in the Western world that like this conscious mind, this mind up here, controls the show. It's like it's what drives everything. It's the thing. And when most people do work, they're like, how do I understand it here? How do I logic it and like really like put the pieces together in my conscious mind? But the conscious mind is only useful to the point of bringing awareness to things. And for when you learn how to work with it. And what I mean by work with it is you can use the conscious mind to direct your actual unconscious. And like we were saying yesterday is that if you were just in a full meditative state all day, if you were just always conscious, you were always the observer, you were just this Zen, like enlightened being, like, yeah, your conscious mind would be running the show most of the time because you are what we call conscious. You're conscious of everything.
Okay. Yeah.
However, how many people do we know that are actually 100% conscious all the time at every moment? I know zero. And I do this work. And what most people that have done a lot of development work and they have some sort of conscious practices are usually around 10% of their waking brain is in their conscious mind. 10% of the brain activity. Wow. This is people that are doing work and they're like have practices, like I saw you meditating this morning and I do as well. 10% is conscious. And the average American, when they look at brain scans and everything, is actually less than 2% because they're in fight or flight. They're in stress mode. They're in overwhelm all the time. And so if people resonate with that feeling of overwhelm and like always stressed and always like worrying, like which most people do because we're taught to in the Western world, are operating from only 2% of this thing that we think is controlling the show. So that means 98% of how we operate, how we move, how we think, how we speak comes from the unconscious. And it actually makes sense when you explain it, because if you woke up this morning and every single morning you had to teach yourself how to walk, you wouldn't get anything done as a being, as a human. So what happens is we learn patterns of like, oh, this is how I do this thing. And using the example of walking, when you learned how to walk the first time, you only learned because you witnessed other people like you doing this thing. You're like, oh, all these other adult humans, they're walking on 2 feet. I'm over here rolling around, I'm on 4s, and you're making sense. And you're like, okay, so you get up. But and they prove this with in studies where they develop mammals with other species, they adapt to the species. And as humans, we're actually the most adaptable creature on the planet. And so we adapt to what we see and experience. So how we experience the world is what we play out.
Right.
So we see the world as this way. Okay, when dad says this, mom responds this way. When mom gets stressed, she does this. When we're in a public place, like this is how we behave. Like all of these things we're experiencing as we develop, and they get ingrained just like walking, and then we're like, oh, this is how we operate.
Right.
When you start becoming aware that not everyone moves like you, thinks like you, speaks like you, feels like you realize that there's actually infinite number of scripts. And you only have one of them.
Right.
You have the one you were given.
Right.
And so you can start saying like, like this is a part of my script that I'd like to pull out this piece of code. It's not serving me anymore. Maybe at some point it did.
Yeah.
I'll pull it out. I'll put something new in there.
Right.
And the putting the new in only comes as a result of pulling out the old.
Right.
Most of what happens in the personal development world is just stacking things on top. And all that's doing is trimming weeds. It's exhausting. It's like pushing a weighted sled uphill. When really, we can just reteach ourselves how to walk emotionally, mentally,
Right.
speak, like our verbal communication.
Right.
We can reteach that on an unconscious level. Yeah.
So you see somebody with that swagger that you want to walk with.
Yeah.
And you can reteach yourself
Yeah.
how to get there rather than like stacking more on top.
Rather than like pretending and putting habits in, and like that's what all the books are about. They're like, oh, okay, do this thing, like do this, and to be successful, put this habit on. And there's some usefulness to that, but that's actually stage 5 of the process of healing, which is like the integration, the action part. Okay. It's useful, but if you don't replace the stuff in between of getting the crap out of the way, you're literally just going to be exhaustingly trimming the weeds. Right. And it's forceful. It's very, it's energy dependent. And so what happens is when you're tired, this happens in nutrition and physical, when you're tired, when you're exhausted, you don't do the thing you know you should do or you want to do because you don't have the energy for it.
Yes. So is this a good way to know that you are battling reality if you are fatigued?
Yes.
Is there any other?
Yes. If you're in tune with your energy, it's one of the most obvious ways. Energy is what we already drive. Like it's the most obvious. And so if you're constantly stressed, if you're constantly overworked, if you feel like your physical body is exhausted, if you're not sleeping well, if you're using stimulants to survive, basically, if you feel like you're in survival. Like all of these things if you're getting injured, if your digestion's we are beautiful creatures and we're constantly getting feedback.
Yeah.
It's just, are we paying attention to it? Most people aren't.
Right.
It's like, oh, my skin's breaking out and like I got this like gut problem. I got diarrhea every day, or like my shoulder's been hurting for 20 years and like it's
I see it all the time. I've experienced it myself, like this thing that keeps popping up, but you keep pushing it away. But man, it's so like just having this conversation, it's so clear, like your body's going to give you signs. And,
so many.
Yeah.
And here's how I've experienced, this is my experience, my analogy, is it usually comes in 3 different ways. The universe sends us signs, or our body sends us signs, whatever you want to call it. First it's the feather, the brick, and the Mack truck. So first, it's very subtle. And like you're walking down the street, a feather kind of like brushes off of you, and you're like, oh, interesting. What is that? Okay. Some people might not even notice it. Right. So if you're really aware, you're like, oh, that's a sign. Okay, interesting. Most people don't pay attention to it. We learn to, but most people don't. And you're like, okay, feather, whatever. And then you're walking down the street and just a brick hits you in the face or hits you in the chest, and you're like, whoo! That's going to leave a mark. I was like, I should probably pay attention to that. Right. And that's like the nagging thing. It's like, oh, I should really do something about that.
It's like your shoulder just is in throbbing pain after you bench press.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But,
but I can still do it. And you're like, I can still do it. Yeah, exactly. And then you just keep going and bricks are showing up, you're getting hit with bricks, and then one day the Mack truck just runs you over. You get hit by that truck in the semi, and you just get flattened and you can't ignore it anymore. And those are the things like the major illnesses, the major injuries. You get hospitalized, your entire life changes because of it.
Right.
This happens in our emotional life, our physical life, our mental life. And what's happening is that we've been getting signs. We've just, because of what we started the conversation with, the external world is distracting us from paying attention to those signs. The focus outward is keeping us from noticing. And so these practices like you teach and the going inward just allows us to send the focus to be like, oh, interesting, like I didn't wake up rested today, or like, oh man, I'm got bloating in my gut. What did I eat yesterday? And that's just paying attention to the feathers.
Yeah.
So you can just make little corrections, and it's light and it's easy, and you don't have to get hit by the Mack truck.
Right.
And that's what everyone is desiring, but it's a matter of there is some work involved. Like for you, it takes years to reprogram the physical movement patterns to get people unstuck, and the same thing with mental and emotional. The more reinforcement of old patterns, the more you have to reinforce the new patterons. It's like when you teach someone to move, it's like if they don't have bad habits, you can teach them something really quick.
Yes, yes.
But if they've been doing it like really like gnarly for 10 years, like you're going to have to, it's going to take more time. Yeah. And so that's, it's a practice. It's just like a movement practice. Right. It's like we reprogram our thoughts through practice. We reprogram our language and our emotions through practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man. Fascinating. Yes. I'm sure we could go on.
We could go.
This is so good, man. Thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, for sure.
I imagine if people really resonate with this, follow Chris, look into what he's doing and his work. For my Primal Athlete group, if you can give us one activity that can start chipping away at moving in a positive direction, that would be great.
If people want more, like you said, follow me on Instagram. I do videos and put out content.
Yeah, what's your handle?
My full name, Chris Marhefka.
Okay.
So we'll spell it out.
Flash it on the screen.
And then I run a company called Training Camp for the Soul, trainingcampforthesoul.com. And we do these emotional healing programs virtually and in person, and they support people in learning this process that no one else is really doing in personal development. It's at a very deep unconscious level, and it's a simple process. It works for everyone who does the work, period. Yeah. And then lastly, you experience this, our men's retreat. I do men's leadership and masculine work. It's something I'm very passionate about, is leading leaders in getting more in tune with their hearts so that they can lead from this place of inspiration in the world. So, yeah.
It was phenomenal. We went deep.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, and I recommend you guys checking out Chris. And hey, man, I think part 2 is in order. So
anytime. Anytime.
See you soon.
Yeah, thank you, brother.